Welcome. My name is Becky. I'm the Programming and Collection Development Librarian here at Storrs Library. Thank you for joining us for Beekeeping Then and Now tonight. We have backyard beekeeper and park ranger Susan Ashman. She'll be exploring some of the history of beekeeping. We'll take a look at the different hives over time, learn about beekeeping in early New England, and discover what you can do to help these little pollinators out. Susan Ashman is an interpretive park ranger and a historic weapons supervisor at the Springfield Armory National Historic Site. This program tonight is co-hosted by Storrs Library and the Longmeadow Historical Society. So Susan, thank you for joining us. Everyone, thank you for joining us tonight for this presentation. Let's get started.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I just want to say for taking the time, everybody, and joining me tonight. And in no way am I an expert on bees, but I am totally fascinated with the hive dynamics, and I love sharing the information with anybody who really would like to listen to it. So tonight I'm going to talk about the history of honeybees, the makeup of the hive, and beekeeping today. So how I got interested in bees is I was working at Old Sturbridge Village, and during the 80s, they had a really vibrant bee program there. But if some of you have heard about the colony collapse disorder and they lost the hives they had there, they weren't doing historical beekeeping there. They were modern day hives. They were in the orchards at that time, but for the programs, they would talk about historic beekeeping in the 19th century. So when I was working there in early 2000 and later than that, I really pushed to try to get the beekeeping program back in the village. And luckily, we were able to do that. So I went to bee school for a couple of weeks in March for 2 years straight, just to get the hang of it. And then we were able to reintroduce bees back at the Armory. So in the 1940s, sorry, my slides aren't going. There we go. In the 1940s, it was estimated that there was over 5 million honeybees in America. And sadly, today, it's thought to be half that number. So in the winter of 2012, 2013, there was a 30% loss in honeybee colonies, which is the highest recorded loss in recent history. So many refer to this as colony collapse disorder. And just the honeybees disappear or the colony dies. And the reason behind this has basically stunned researchers. Everything from pesticides, pathogens, mites, environmental and management stressors have been researched, but it's amazing that no definitive answer has been reached as of yet. So in 2013, to bring awareness on just how crucial pollinators are to our food system, Whole Food Market in University Heights, Rhode Island, they actually removed all the produce that comes from plants dependent on honeybees and other pollinators. And more than 85% of the plant species on Earth requires bees and other pollinators to exist. So Whole Foods employees pulled produce and products from the shelves that depended on pollination. That was 237 out of 453 items, 52%. So you hear that variety is the spice of life, but you wouldn't get too much of that in regards to food if it wasn't for our pollinators. So there are approximately 20,000 species of bees. 4,000 native bee species were present in North America when the Europeans began to settle. And none of those native bees at that time produced honey. So for the longest time, scientists did believe that honeybees were not native to America. But it's pretty neat. In 2009, a 14-million-year-old fossil was unearthed in Nevada, of all places, of a female worker bee. So it's pretty neat that honeybee is proof that North America was a native range of the honeybees at one time, but the species, that one, did not survive. And scientists and researchers wonder if that was colony collapse disorder at that time, even then. So the earliest methods of beekeeping were recorded on the walls of Egyptian tombs. And honey was used as a sweetener during that time in their breads, their cakes, their alcoholic drinks. And honey was also used to embalm the dead. So the honeybee was considered sacred and often regarded as the symbol of resurrection to the Egyptians. And when archaeologists discovered King Tut's tomb in 1922, amongst all the treasure that was in the tomb was actually a lot of honey. And I can't believe how the archaeologists decided who was going to taste it, but they did. And it actually tasted like honey of all things. So it's a natural food and it never goes bad. So honeybees were reintroduced to the East Coast of North America in 1622. There is no record of bees being on the Mayflower at all. But the Council of Virginia Company in London wrote to the governor of Virginia on December 5th, 1621, stating, "We have by the ship sent you diverse sorts of seeds and fruit trees, as well as pigeons, rabbits, peacocks, and beehives." So the European honeybees did arrive in Jamestown in early 1622. And the honeybee population basically multiplied with the feral swarms. They spread out. And it's really, really hard to believe. I was surprised that it took about another 231 years for the bees to get all the way out to the West Coast. And that was by ship. So of course it would be pretty difficult to bring honeybees overland during that time. So early on, Egyptians and settlers would keep their bees in skeps made out of rye or grass straw. And unfortunately, to get that honey out of there, you would have to hold that whole skep over smoke or a fire to get the bees out of it first. And then unfortunately, you have to pull all the comb out of there, all that the bees made, and then they would have to start over again. So you're really just destroying that whole hive. So I just want to read to you really quick in the Farmer's Cabinet, volume 6 of 1841. "I myself was told by a bee master that he always saw the ghosts of the bees the night after he burned them, and have heard of an old woman who never went to church the Sunday following. She felt that she had done a most cruel deed, and she was right in her thinking." So there was all sorts of different hives during that time early on. Some people would use wood, some people used flour, like cooking flour barrels. Some people used flour pots at that time too, or hollowed out logs. And you can see some of the feral hives in the woods if you ever come across one. And this is how they usually build their comb in logs. Some people got pretty creative also with their beehives. So from the New England Farmer periodical in 1837, it reads, "A New York Yankee has invented an improved beehive, which is said to have the appearance of, and to be in fact, a mahogany sideboard with the drawers above and a closet below, with glass doors to be placed in the chamber of a house and to be connected with the open air by a tube passing through the wall. The operations of the bees are clearly seen through the glass doors, and the honey is deposited in the drawer." So I believe that this may be an early observation hive that people had even in the early 1800s. So if any of you have a mahogany chest and you don't know what to do with it, you can always turn it into an observation hive in your house there. So farmers were already experimenting with box hives, and Reverend Lorenzo Langstroth was an American apiarist, a clergyman, a teacher, and considered to be the father of American beekeeping. Just here in America, not European. He basically took some of his ideas from European beekeepers who were already working with wooden hives at that time. So he invented or designed the modern beehive that you mostly see today, the box hives. But he was also known for discovering bee space. And he found by leaving a space between the top of the frame where the hives were and the inner cover, that the bees would not put their comb on top of that area. And again, that's called bee space. And on a side note, Lorenzo Langstroth was a principal of a young ladies school in Greenfield, Massachusetts. So each year in May, Greenfield celebrates Lorenzo Langstroth with the Greenfield Bee Festival. So this is one of my favorite pictures here. The Battle of Antietam was on September 17th, 1862. And you can see there's a close-up, which looks like box hives there. So what was happening there is this was the roulette farm, and the 132nd Pennsylvania Volunteers were advancing on that farm. But then all of a sudden, there was a shot, artillery shot from a Confederate battery, and it hit the yard. So of course it disturbed the bees, and they were firing muskets there too. So the bees actually swarmed. Some men dropped their rifles and ran, and some stayed and were slapping the bees. And if anybody knows, it's probably the worst thing you could do is sit there and slap the bees. And it's pretty neat because if you look at this picture on the fence, you're going to see that big kind of like a blob there in the middle of the fence rail. That looks like the swarm of bees because they don't usually go too far from the hive at that time. So it's interesting that the Union had two enemies contend with that day. They had the angry bees and also the Confederates. So I want to talk to you now about the dynamics in the hive and what you would see in a hive. And this never changes throughout the years. You're always going to have a queen bee. And she's got the largest, she's the largest bee in the hive. She has a really slender body. And the drone is the male, and he's pretty stocky, and you can see he's got some pretty big eyes. And the worker forager bees, they're all females, and they're pretty petite. So the queen, her primary job is to lay as many eggs as she can, which could be around 1,500 a day, and to produce a chemical scent that actually helps regulate the unity of the colony at that time. It's pretty rare to find more than one queen in a hive. I won't say it never happens, but it's pretty rare. And the only time that she's going to leave the hive is once to mate or twice if the hive swarms. So mating is done in the air with the drone approximately 1/2 to 1 mile high in the drone congregation area. I always think of this as kind of like a bar for bees up in the sky or something. She does not mate with bees in her own colony, but with various neighboring colonies. And if she's a lucky girl, she's probably going to mate with upwards of 20 drones, which could take 20 or 10 to 30 minutes per flight. And the more varied genetics, the better for the hive. So it's a pretty violent affair, the mating. The drone will mount the queen, and he's going to insert his endophallus, ejaculate in semen. And after ejaculation, the drone's going to pull away, but his endophallus is going to remain inside the queen at that time. And this actually causes his abdomen to rip open, and he falls to his death. So supposedly some drones don't die. I don't know how they live through that, but usually that's what happens. And again, there's so many different species of honeybees. You have Italians, you have Russians, you have Carnolians, you have Saskatraz, and you want the queen to have as many different drones as you can. And again, it just makes your hive so much stronger. So queens, when she gets back to the hive, she starts laying her eggs, and she can live 7 or more years, but her productivity starts slowing down after usually the first 2 years. I've talked to beekeepers, and they usually will change out their queen I hear some even every year or so, because she'll produce more the younger she is. So here's a picture of the cells inside the frame. So on my right here, it looks like little rice. And then on the left, you got some larvae. So usually once 3 days from the queen laying the egg, it's going to hatch. And at that time, the nurse bees are going to feed it what's called royal jelly. On the 5th day, they're going to seal that with a wax cap on it. And then the bee is going to create a larva. And around her larva is going to be a cocoon, just like a butterfly in there. And from the baby until she chews her way out of the comb there, it takes about 21 days for a worker bee, 24 days for a drone, and about 16 days for a queen to come out of there. So let's discuss the role of a drone here. He's on the top, you can tell by his eyes, and actually there isn't much to discuss with him. His primary role is to mate with a queen, but again, not the queen in the same hive. You would think he is the most ineffective bee in the hive since they don't work, they don't sting, they don't even feed themselves. Mating with a different queen brings a wide variety of genetics to the hive at that time. And then once fall rolls around, the female worker bees have had enough of the lazy drones, so they stop feeding them, which weakens them, and then they push them out of the hive, and then they basically freeze when fall comes around. So if you look around a hive, you're going to see a good part of some dead drones in front of that hive at that time. So the majority of the bees in the hive are female worker bees. And sadly, they basically work themselves to death, living only 5 to 7 weeks. And at its peak during the summer, a hive can have as many as 80,000 bees in that colony. And they control what goes on in the hive. It's not the queen, it's the workers. So they collect pollen and nectar, they feed the queen, they clean her, they feed the drone, the larvae, they make wax. And they will also make the decision to kill and make a new queen if she is not laying enough eggs, which is it's pretty fascinating, again, the dynamics, because what they'll do if she's not laying enough eggs, they do something they call, it's called balling her, and they get into a cluster, and then they just keep getting closer and closer and creating more heat until she dies. But what they do before that is they will make a new queen before they kill the old queen. So worker bees can visit about 50 to 100 flowers on a collection trip and fly up to 6 miles a day. And they carry pollen in pollen baskets, but they're not really baskets though. It's just long hairs on their legs that help hold the pollen in place as the bees fly. So it also sticks to their body. So it's kind of like Velcro. So here's a frame, and that's honey on there, capped honey. And honey is basically 80% sugars and 20% water. And it's the only food made by an insect that humans can eat. And honey was found in Egyptian pyramids over 3,000 years ago, but yet it's still edible. And how do honeybees make honey? Well, when their pollen baskets are filled, the worker bees make their way back to the hive. The nectar is regurgitated from one worker bee to a house bee, and it breaks down the sugars of the nectar further. So what they're going to do is it is passed on. They regurgitate it, pass it to the house bee. It's in their stomach. It breaks down their enzymes. They regurgitate it, pass it on to another nurse bee, and it continues until they have broken down the sugar content from about 70 to 20%. And I'm always amazed, like, how do they know that percentage at that time? So it basically involves digestion, regurgitation, enzyme activity, and evaporation. The honeybees then fan the remaining nectar in the comb by beating their wings to evaporate the remaining water content. And then once it's at that point, they cap the cell. So those open cells are still being worked on. evaporating that water content again, and then all the other ones you can see have a very, very light wax capping on that. One of the most fascinating things I think about bees is the wax. And if anybody knows before I had bees, I had no idea where the wax was produced. But they have a special wax producing gland in their abdomen of their bodies. And the special gland actually converts the sugar from the honey into a waxy substance, and it deposits the flakes of the substance on their abdomen. And so the small flakes are gathered by other bees, chewed in their mouth, and then the bees add that chewed wax to the wax foundation on a frame, creating a comb. I mean, you can't make that stuff up. I'm always so surprised just how much they can do. So just like people, bees need their sleep. And I know there's a lot of us who don't like to drive in the dark, and bees don't really like to fly in the dark because they can't see very well. So they actually sleep 5 to 8 hours a night inside the hive, but sometimes in flowers as well. And I'm sure you've seen when you wake up early in the morning on a hot summer, it's a summer night, and in the morning it's still very warm. You'll find some carpenter bees or big bumblebees. They'll still be on the sunflowers or even some honeybees. And you could actually touch them at that time because they're still, they need a little more warmth to wake them up and get them moving again. Also, just like us, or some of us, bees like to dance, and there is a waggle and a round dance that they do. And the waggle dance means that the pollen and nectar is farther away, and the bees will communicate the flower location, especially if it's a good flower patch. And one bee dances while the other bees watch to learn the direction where that good pollen or nectar is. And smell and taste from the flower patch the dancer came from helps the other bees identify the correct flower patch. So it's usually in a figure eight they go, or the complete round dance. The figure eight is when the pollen and nectar is further away. So this is a really good picture of a frame pulled out of a box hive, a Langstroth hive, which I'll show you a closer version of. And so all of that deep yellow on there is the brood cells, and those are the open ones have hatched out, and the capped ones are still waiting. So there's going to be a lot of bees there. Now on the bottom, those are swarm cells. So when you have a pretty strong hive and it gets too crowded, the bees are going to swarm, and it's pretty common. And it's like when families outgrow their home and it's time to move. The workers are the ones that signal when it is time to swarm. They're going to build swarm cells for the new queen, and then once they are built, the queen will lay eggs in them. And then before they are ready to leave, the queen's going to stop laying eggs. They have the new queens inside that cell, and then the worker bees are going to stop foraging at that time too. But what they do, since they don't know where their new home's going to be, they just gorge on so much of that honey. So they're going to go on a long trip, so they're just going to eat and eat until it's time to go. So this is actually a picture of my hives when they were swarming. And when the queen is ready, she's going to leave the hive and take about half the hive with her. And usually it's the younger ones that are going with her. And I have to say it is an incredibly beautiful sight to see when they do swarm. I think when a lot of people think of a swarm of bees, it's frightening to them when you think of that many insects in a clump. But actually, this is when they're probably the most harmless, is because they're engorged with honey, so they're not going to go far. They just don't fly out of the hive and just leave. They stick around, they circle the hive, they stay close in the center. So it takes a while for all those bees to get out at one time. And you can see down at the bottom, they're kind of clumping and waiting there as well. So once they leave, they're going to find an area to stick on. And she's going to find anywhere. Look at that, a side mirror or a tree, or really mine didn't go very far, which was quite nice, right in front of the hive. And they're going to usually stay that way for hours, could be days, and the scout bees are going to locate a new home at that time. So the queen's actually just going to stay and emit these pheromones that signal the workers to cluster around here. So whenever you see a big cluster, the queen is inside there, only that one queen. So once a new home is found, the entire cluster is going to take flight and move to the new location and begin to build a comb, develop a new brood, gather in nectar and pollen. And again, the swarm may look pretty scary at first due to the size, but it's kind of like when you have a Thanksgiving dinner, the last thing you want to do is like run a race or anything. So you just are going to stay there. And again, the bees will just leave on their own when they have find a new home. These are a problem when it's in late summer because the bees don't have enough time to make enough honey to get through the winter. It usually takes about 70 to 100 pounds of honey for a colony to get through a winter. So what do bees do in the winter? Well, they do not sleep through it like bears, that's for sure. They just cluster in there in order to stay warm. So a lot of people try to insulate their hives at that time, but bees create their own heat source. And since they don't leave the hive, they rely on their own food source as well. So again, you really have to have a lot of honey in there. And it's pretty neat. You can see this thermal picture of the bees in there. So there's a couple of boxes. Usually the bees are on the bottom of the box. And if their food's on the top, the bees are going to start moving on the top to get to their food source. But the problem is too, with the weather, the way it's been, sometimes the bees will get out of the cluster. And when the weather changes drastically, the bees will freeze because they don't have enough time to cluster back in there. And what they do is they vibrate their flight muscles, keeping their wings still at that time, which raises their body temperature. And with 1,000 of bees shivering, not because they're cold, but because of those flight muscles, the temperature at the center of that cluster is going to warm to about 93 degrees. So when the worker bees on the outer edge of the cluster get cold, they're going to push to the center of that group, and then they rotate positions in there. And also bees will not defecate inside the hive, even in the winter time. So they wait for a sunny day, maybe when it's about, in the 40s or so, and it's pretty neat where it's snow on the ground and you're going to see the bees just go out for a quick trip. And then they go right back into the hive afterwards, and then they cluster again. So there are different types of beehives that you're going to see. These are probably the ones you see the most. This is a Langstroth hive. This is Lorenzo's Langstroths. And you can see how it's built there or stacked at that time. So the two bottom boxes usually are for the brood boxes, and that's for the babies. And then the two upper boxes, the smaller ones, are for the honey. And usually there's two or more because people are harvesting that honey sometimes twice or 3 times a season. They can do that, but you always want to make sure you have enough honey for your bees. So this is when you pull a frame out of the hive, if it's a good frame, this is what you're going to see. Again, that yellow is all capped brood. And then on the top sides, that is the capped honey in there too. Another type of hive is a top bar hive. And some beekeepers choose these for different reasons. There's no heavy lift into these. You don't have to purchase an expensive honey extractor. You don't agitate the bees as much when you have a box hive. And there's a full length observation window that you can see. So it's a more of a natural, non-intrusive way to keep bees. But the downside is you can't add bars to it. So once you go all the way out with it, the bees are either going to swarm or they're going to stop producing brood at that time. And to harvest the honey, you basically cut it off that bar and you're destroying that whole comb, because you've just got to get the bees, all the bees off there. And then basically you just mash that honeycomb to extract all that honey out of there. So this is the, I don't know how many of you have seen these. I've never seen one of these in somebody's yard. This was designed in 2015. It's called a flow hive. It was designed in Australia. They are out here and for sale, I think in 2018. I'm curious to see how this would do in Massachusetts or New England, a cold area, because a lot of it is plastic. We all know how plastic, what happens in the cold here. So this is a European design originally. And what you're doing, you don't even have to open anything up to extract honey. So what you do is you turn the key and inside the honeycomb, the cells split. And then it creates a channel for the honey to flow down while the bees remain undisturbed on the surface of the comb. And it's pretty interesting because the advertising is, watch as pure fresh honey flows right out of the hive and into your jar. So to me, it kind of looks like a beer tap or something for honey. So I'm always curious how those ones will do. So when you have a Langstroth hive, this is basically how you extract the honey. The hardest part, I think, of extracting honey from a hive is getting those frames out of there and getting the bees off. What I do, I take those frames out and I have to really fast put them in like a Rubbermaid container and put the lid down on it. You race into the garage and there's always bees. I don't know how, but they always follow you too. So you just get a knife and you cut off all those caps, and then the honey is gonna start going down, and then you put it in an extractor, and then you start cranking it, and through that force, it's gonna spin out the honey from that frame without destroying the comb. And the neat part is, after you extracted that honey from the frames, you can put that just in front of the hive, set it in front of there, and the bees clean it up so nicely after that. So who's been stung by a honeybee? I can't even tell you how many times I've been stung. Yeah. And honeybees are the only type of bee that dies once it stings you. And when they sting you, there's this lancet. So the honeybees can't pull those stingers out because two of the barbed lancets on the edge there. And then what happens is it not only leaves the stinger, but part of the bee's digestive tract, the muscles and nerves. So it's basically an abdominal rupture that kills the bees. And it seems like always the case, like when there's one bee, they call their friends over too to get you as well. So that's never good. So what can you do to help out our pollinators? Try to avoid pesticides, especially like on your lawn. I know it's great to have one of those chem lawns. It looks really pretty, but actually bees during the early morning, during spring through usually late summer, they're on your lawn collecting the dew from the grass. So having pesticides on your lawn doesn't do very good for the bees because they take that back to the hive. Plant flowers for pollinators. There's plenty of those, even something as simple as a sunflower. Catmint is always good, lavender. Give bees a nesting place, you know, after your gardens have the season's over, leave them up there for a while. They do like even different pollinators, like your big bumblebees, like to nest in the leaves. Don't get rid of dandelions in the spring. My lawn looks pretty bad, but it's covered in dandelions, and that's a really very early food source for the bees. Buy organic if you can, and include native plants in your garden. I always like this. It's one of the first spring foods, again, for our bees. And how many of you see skunk cabbage? Like before, I didn't think much about skunk cabbage, but now I see skunk cabbage in a whole new light, because this is like a mini sauna and snack bar for honeybees. So they provide like warmth and shelter for foraging bees very, very, very early in the spring or even late winter. Usually the eastern skunk cabbage can generate heat, reaching temperatures which range from 59 to 95 degrees above the air temperature. So bees, this is when bees are just out very early. They can't wait to get out of that hive either. And so the flour inside the shell gives off heat, creating like this little warm shelter, again, like a sauna for the bees. So I always like seeing this around. So the Armory here is a climate-friendly park. Last year, I installed a hive of Italian honeybees in back of the Commandant's house at the Armory. We also planted a 3-acre field in back to make a pollinator habitat for the bees. So if you ever come to the Armory, come and talk to me about bees, because just between us, I do like talking about bees kind of more than firearms sometimes. So please do. And thank you so much for your time. And more than anything, I do hope you learned something new about honeybees tonight. So if you have any questions, I would love to answer them.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. That was so wonderful, but also I'm so grateful that we were able to record it, because there's so much information I'm going to want to revisit. I just want to thank you again for letting us record tonight. I've got some applause in the audience, some emojis. Just a reminder, everyone, as I just said, it is being recorded. If you prefer not to be recorded, please feel welcome to use the chat box. You do have the option of turning on your microphones now if you would like to join in on the conversation. Oh, it looks like we have somebody from Dublin, Ireland. I have a thank you from Dublin, Ireland, where we have the native blackbait.
Oh, neat. Nice.
So I'm just double checking. We have some comments, but I don't think we had any questions yet. But sometimes comments. I didn't realize how intense bee life was. Someone said instead of Game of Thrones, Game of Bees. It seems very intense.
They are so fascinating. It's like they have their own little city inside the hive. Like they have the mayor, they have a police force. Because I had a problem at the Armory where yellow jackets were trying to get into the hive. You know, they were doing everything they could. And I was nervous because a couple of times I saw them go in. And it's almost like they were trying to sell something to them, because after just a few seconds, like a honeybee would come out escorting the yellow jacket, like, yeah, we're really not interested in the Tupperware right now, you know, move along. Or you see them battling in air, the bees will fly out with them in tow, which is fascinating. See them like rolling on the ground. So just watching them is amazing. I just look at them in a whole new light, how much they do for us.
So I see someone turned on their microphone. Did we have a question or comment that they wanted to share?
Yeah, Susan, thank you so much for your talk. I was just interested. I have 3 hives. But I'm always interested in picking other beekeepers' brains. What do you use to insulate your hive?
So what I did is this year I was having a problem keeping them over winter, like big problems, because I really hated to treat the bees. But I started with doing the hop strips, and then I made a moisture box this year. Do you use those at all, moisture boxes?
I have not installed a moisture box, but I actually just built a couple of them. I'm probably going to be putting them in this weekend.
Yeah, and so that really helps. And then what I did was I got pallets and put insulated foam in the pallet on 3 sides. And then what I do is just put it over the hive itself. And if you want, like, I can send you a picture of it.
That'd be great.
Yeah. What area do you live in?
I live in Long Meadow.
Oh, no, you should come by the Armory then. And and I can show you what it looks like or whatever's easier for you.
Great.
So, yeah. So if you want, you can put your email in the chat or contact me at the Armory. And I'd love to talk.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, we do have a couple questions that came in the chat box. Is beekeeping very time consuming? Does the hive need daily attention?
I think you don't want to be a bee haver where you think you could just put them in the hive and then you don't have to bother with them. I would say, to me, it gets a little more involved because it's harder to winter over the bees. Usually I check them during the summertime about every 2 weeks. As long as they have food and brood, I just close up the hive right away. You also have to make sure that they don't, there's not too much honey, because sometimes you got to take honey out of there to give them more room. I think in some ways it is involved because you have to feed them. You have to prevent mites or treat them for mites. That's another problem. You have to feed them when there's not enough pollen. So you're feeding them sugar water. That's an extra cost at that time. So you do have to monitor them. And you might get stung too. So if hopefully you don't have allergies.
Someone asked as well if it's beneficial for the honeybees for an average person to have a hive in their yard if they can.
I think it's pretty beneficial. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't even like honey that much, but I just like watching them. It's so fascinating because how much they do for us. But then again, a lot of people say they are competition for our native bees as well, which that's a great point. You know, honeybees were fine before we started keeping them in hives. And so are we really helping them that much? You know, plus with all the pesticides today, that's really hard for bees today. And they still haven't figured out about this colony collapse disorder and what's causing it.
Do you think it would be more beneficial to have a hive or for us to follow some of the tips that you provided just to encourage them, like not using pesticides and that sort of thing?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. I think in some ways, just me personally, you see how pesticides are just used so much. So I think there's such a battle. But some people are getting into, you know, I'm sure you've seen organic honey, but how do you really know, unless you live on an island, that it's organic honey? Like that the bees aren't going, like there's this, you know, an invisible dog fence, but it's an invisible honey fence and the bees aren't going beyond that for that organic. So, you know, that's a really great question. I'd love to think that I'm helping bees, but sometimes I think they know what they're doing more than I know what I'm doing with them. So I'm sure anybody who has bees, you open that box and you're like, wait, this wasn't in the book and this was not at bee school. Like, what are you guys doing? So it can be challenging.
Right. So I see we have a couple of people who are having to leave. They have some other meetings. So thank you for joining us. I'm sorry you have to dash out a minute early, but it was great to have you. We have someone, our visitor from Ireland said there's now a push to have people grow plants for pollinators rather than have beehives.
I could not understand your question.
Sorry, it was a comment. Our visitor from Ireland said there is now a push to have people grow plants for pollinators rather than to have beehives themselves.
Yeah, that's, you know what, that's a great point, because that's what we can do here. People who have allergies to bee stings and such, I think that's super, where you can make your own pollinator garden, because it doesn't take much at all, especially people who like to grow herbs. The bees love different herbs and borage and dill. So like I said, catmint, all sorts, lavender and such like that. And it's so easy to make your own pollinator garden as well. Sunflowers, bees love those as well. So that's a great point. If you can't have bees, I know some cities where you live, there's an ordinance against keeping bees, but if you can't, pollinator gardens are so beneficial.
Great. We have another question. How do you tell a honeybee from other kinds of bees? I know what a bumblebee looks like, but what about the others? Right, because sometimes I think people think, they get them confused with yellow jackets, hornets, wasps, and honeybees. I always look at the herky-jerky movements of like hornets and especially yellow jackets. Like to me, honeybees are much smooth flyers. Also, they're more of a brown and fuzzy beige stripe, where your yellow jackets have that distinct black and white stripe. They just look like bees on meth or something. They're just they're angry. But yeah, mostly it's the honeybee is like a little furry and brown and goldish. All right. I was wondering, you mentioned keeping the dandelions in your spring. Is it only in the spring, or can you just leave them all season long? You can leave them all season long, but I think people are very concerned about how good their grass looks. I'm like one of them now. So yeah, I've even seen dandelions now. I think with this weather we're having, things are pretty confused right now. Right. So I don't have any other questions or comments at the moment. Do we have any other final thoughts, questions, comments? I saw someone's mic just turned on. I can type in my email address here, and then if anybody has any questions or wants to come by the Armory, I would love that. So we can talk bees. Great. There we go. Yeah, probably in the springtime, I'll start doing some programs. I think I'm gonna, if I can get some honey, I'm gonna extract at work too, not outside, of course, downstairs in the basement classroom. So anybody who wants to try their hand at extracting, they can come by and do that as well. All right, great. And for anybody, if you haven't located the chat, the email is Susan_Ashman at N as in Nancy, P as in Paul, S as in Sam, nps.gov. And I'll include that when I send everybody the video link as well. Super. So if we don't have any other questions or comments, I think this is a great time to wrap it up. Susan, I want to thank you again for sharing your expertise and your contact information so that we can follow up with any other questions that we might have. I encourage everybody to visit the Armory. Susan has done some great programs for us, continues to do great work. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thanks everybody. I appreciate your time very much.